Welcome, everyone. My name is Juan de Lara. I am the director of the Latinx and Latin American Studies Center at the University of Southern California. We are a brand new center that is committed to interdisciplinary research and public-facing scholarship that focuses on Latina and Latino communities both within the United States and in Latin America. We take a hemispheric approach in the work that we do because we think it's very important to bring Latin American studies and Latino studies into conversation with one another, something that has not happened enough. And in order to address some issues that cross as many borders, cultural, political, disciplinary, as do the people of the Americas. So I want to welcome you all today. Bienvenidos a todos y a todas. We're going to conduct this conversation in English. We do, if you need to ask a question in Spanish or another language, please feel free to do so in the question and answer function on the right. We will be looking at the questions, trying to synthesize some of those questions, and then we will turn those over to the panelists to address those questions at the end of the conversation. So now I want to turn this over because we want to move quickly into the conversation to Professor Hernán Galperín, who will introduce our presenters and will moderate the conversation. He is a professor in the School of Annenberg at USC and has done a lot of research on social movements and online civil society. So please remember, ask questions as we go through the conversation, and we will be monitoring those. Hernán, it's all yours.
Thank you, Juan. Good, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we have people from many different time zones. Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to introduce my friends and colleagues, Manuel Castells and Fernando Calderón. I will make a very brief introduction because their career and CVs is long and distinguished, and it will take just too much time. So I'll just introduce their latest positions. Fernando Calderón is a professor and research director at Universidad Nacional de San Martín in Buenos Aires. He also previously held the Simón Bolívar Chair at the University of Cambridge. And Manuel Castells is a colleague of mine at the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. He's actually a university professor and the Wallace Annenberg Chair in Communication Technology and Society at the USC Annenberg School, and is currently Minister of Universities in his native Spain. So that's a very brief introduction. I will turn over to Manuel and Fernando to present and introduce the main ideas of their new book. And then we'll open for Q&A. As Juan said, please post your questions on the chat box so we can look at them as they speak. So Fernando and Manuel, the floor is yours. Thank you.
I want to make sure to unmute yourself, Manuel and Fernando.
I am Manuel. We agreed that I would go first, and if I survive, he will try. Do you hear me, first of all? Okay. Well, I really want to thank very sincerely Juan and also my dear friend and colleague for many years, Hernán Galperín, and the Center for Latin American Studies and Latin American Studies for your initiative in organizing this panel. Is truly important for me. This is both in terms of the importance of this work that we have done with Fernando, and also because being away, I really value the contact with my intellectual home, where I hope to return. In fact, I shall return. And in the meantime, I feel very nostalgic in many ways, but I am, as many of you are, in the trenches of fighting the pandemics and many other associated social, political, and economic ills. So not to waste too much time, simply say that this book caps in some way, although we are not finished, but caps in some way the research work on Latin America that Fernando Calderón and I have conducted for many, many years, and focuses particularly on a series of empirical studies and elaborations that we did together, but also leading a number of researchers in the last 10 years. The aim of this book was to provide an overall analysis of the main trends that have transformed deeply Latin America in the last decade. In fact, in the last 2 decades. This is not a book of case studies. This is a book that picks up a number of issues that we consider to be essential and which are transversal to everything. And we are trying to define these issues and to elaborate them, going over many, many different themes, and including all countries in Latin America, but again, not country studies, but issue studies. I think what is a good starting point is our analysis of what we consider to have been the defining contradictions linked to the incorporation of Latin America into the global economy in the last 25 years in an accelerated way. This incorporation took place through, in the schematic, 2 different models. One, what we have tried to define, not to invent another word when everybody is using it, neoliberalism, which is the priority to the market as a way of incorporating Latin America to the global networks of wealth and creation of accumulation of capital and creation of technology, etc. And the other is what we call neo-developmentalism, using the Latin American term, in which, on the contrary, while maintaining the market as a key mechanism, but the emphasis is on the state and state policies. Our argument is that although these 2 models overlap to some extent, both models have failed. And they have both failed in terms of not being able not only to ensure a process of development, but to actually to stabilize Latin American societies. To some extent, both have succeeded in modernizing technologically and economically most of Latin America, but at the same time, both largely collapsed under the impact of the socio-political movements, rebellions, and reactions that they prompted by their specific dynamics. In the case of neoliberalism, widespread inequality, exclusion, social exclusion was absolutely critical, and the fact that the governments were in fact not correcting any of these inequalities, but actually emphasized the inequalities, has led to a large extent to the inability of the market to take care, as was never really able to, of Latin American huge social and economic problems. You remember a series of crises, social crises, that led to the halt of this model, starting with the Corralito in Argentina in 2001, but then the model goes back and forth, and Argentina tried again much later, and guess what? 2019 was another collapse of the same neoliberal model tried by the new administration. And of course, the archetypical neoliberal model that has been Chile over many, many years, unexpectedly for most observers, except for Fernando and myself, collapsed also under the impact of the social mobilizations, largely not controlled by any traditional political party or unions in 2009, and that in fact continue to accentuate and have forced to start with a change in the political model. From the socio-political dreams of the neoliberal model emerge alternatives within the institutional system that try to channel the new demands, the new social mobilizations into an alternative political model and into an alternative development model centered on the actions of the state. That was largely the case of Brazil, but also of another series of countries that we all have in mind, not to go into specifics and keep analytical focus in mind. This was able, in fact, to connect to the global economy under conditions of, at the same time, economic dynamism and social redistribution inside a number of countries. One of the key elements was what Fernando Calderón has conceptualized as informational extractivism, that is a new way in which to incorporate to the global market of raw materials, agricultural markets, and the new technological conditions. And also the connection to the new conditions of the global economy, particularly the China connection that has been decisive in supporting a number of these processes of neo-development. This model, again, Brazil was the main example, but there are a number of others that you have in mind. This model also collapsed for socio-political reasons. And this was largely the reason for two factors. One, as long as global markets continued to favor Latin American inclusion, then there were enough resources channeled through the state to actually redistribute and build new political legitimacy. When this changed and global markets reversed, particularly already in the last 10 years, then was the inability of the state to continue to absorb and redistribute resources from competitiveness led to the state to a number of maneuvers that included the use of public sector companies that were from the state to use them to support their own economic policies. The key issue in the corruption, in the crisis of the state, and particularly of the state at the center of the process of developmentalism, was the crisis of the state itself, particularly what we have identified as the corruption of the state. First of all, I remind you that the state has always throughout Latin American history, the key connector between global networks, global flows of everything, and Latin American societies. And therefore, the issue here is not that the neo-developmentalism was new. No, the state always has been at the center of everything in Latin America. What happened is that at this point, the corruption of the state undermined both the legitimacy and the efficiency of the state in the development process and prompted a rebellion that was not only the traditional rebellion of the oligarchy defending their interests, but the rebellion of the middle classes, and particularly the new middle classes that were resisting and criticizing state corruption. But here is what I call with Fernando the corruption enigma. Why we would say that corruption has been so important lately? Corruption has always been there. It's part of Latin America political economy, and by the way, most of the world as well. The issue is that the state in the latest years became even more corrupt in many ways. In fact, corruption was not marginal, it was central. Of course, one of the spectacular cases was Peru, with 5 presidents, one after another, ending up in jail or in exile or in suicide. And still today, Peru is not stabilized as a political system. There's a new transitional president that is actually very good, I think, but it doesn't matter. The state as such has been largely destabilized. But why corruption has been critical lately, more than ever? Well, I could mention 4 factors empirically identified. First is a structural factor. The state always has been favoring, key to favor the connections with the global economy, particularly in information extractivism, but also the state has been critical in organizing what we call inhuman development, that is the explosion of urban and metropolitan growth in conditions of absolute speculation, and with public markets open up to large companies, many of them Latin American, particularly Odebrecht, the Brazilian company, but others, which actually finance the politics of the developmental state, including parties, and not only in the case of developmental state, but practically in most Latin American societies, they have intervened in exchange of privileged access to the public markets in public works and urbanization. Second, has to do directly with the political process. The political process has been increasingly fragmented. We have observed what Cardoso lately called coalition presidentialism, meaning that the president is elected, in most countries are presidential, but in order to actually govern, has to compromise with a variety of political forces, many of them representative of a specific interest, either regional, economic, social, which therefore exchange political support for specific favors for them and their clientele. Also, the political process has been characterized by the media politics and the scandal politics as in most of the world, including the role of the social networks in destabilizing and creating movements of public opinion that had been largely uncontrolled and dominated by fake news. The third factor is actually properly social and cultural, is the increasing individualization, consumerism, and personal competitiveness, that is everybody trying to simply get ahead, breaking down communitarian networks in most cases, particularly traditional ones, particularly crisis of the Catholic Church, which is a deeply transformative factor, crisis of traditional family, the patriarchal family, and fragmentation and dissolution of social relationships. In this context, culturally speaking, corruption appears for large segments of the population as simply a way of life to get ahead by yourself, since you cannot count on either the state or any reliable institution. And of course, the fourth key factor in why corruption is more important than ever is the rise of the global criminal economy all over the world, but with a particular emphasis in the last 20-25 years in Latin America. As we know, this is today, although largely ignored by mainstream academic thinking in economics, but it's a fundamental sector of the economy in Latin America and in the world. In fact, about 5% of global GDP, which is much more than the automobile industry, for instance. And the global criminal economy requires as a key element the penetration and control of large segments of the state apparatus. And therefore, the corruption, not only of the customs officer and of the local police, but the corruption of the banking system, which is critical for money laundering and of governments and of the armed forces, for instance, in many different countries. So the combination of the four factors has created a crisis, an institutional crisis, which is even more important than the economic crisis and social crisis of the past. In other words, what was the issue in Latin America, that was military threats and coup to destabilize the political institutions, now corruption has become the main destabilizer of political institutions. And without political institutions and with an increasing social and cultural crisis, what we have observed is the increasing, I would say, hostility among people, except in very specific communities, but a rise in local crime, a rise in violence, a rise in threats and attacks against women, precisely because, as Fernando will say in a moment, this transformation of women's consciousness has been a fundamental trend in Latin America these years, and therefore, to the rise of women's consciousness responds the violence of deeply entrenched patriarchalism. In these processes of destabilizing of the models of development, destabilizing of the political institutions, and destabilizing of trust between and among people, this process ultimately has led large segments of Latin America, large parts of the society, almost everywhere, to a situation of chaotic confusion and I would say incertitude, the inability, the uncertainty as a way of life, which we found a Aymara word proposed by Fernando. We characterize in our very dark conclusion Latin America as having entered in the Camanchaca, that is an Andean fog where you cannot see anything, you cannot breathe, you cannot do whatever, because you are lost in the fog. And to actually confirm this was of course a metaphor, an intuition, but to confirm our worst fears, now we got the pandemics. But there are lights of hope, and that is the role of Fernando. He's the good one, I am the bad one.
Okay, I continue. Thank you very much, Manuel. I am very glad to present our book here at the University of Southern California, my friends Manuel University. Thank you. Congratulations for the new Center of Latin American Studies and his director, Professor Juan de Lara, and very special to our historical friend, Hernán Galperin. At this moment, I would like to, we would like to give a special regards to our friend and colleague, John Thompson, as well to the team of Polity Press, and certainly to the Latin American Center at the University of Cambridge. And of course, thank you very much to everybody here. The perspective of our investigations, our investigations pretend to connect global with national transformations. This means how global transformation impact the Latin American changes and how the region change produce impacts at global scale. For example, vis-a-vis the new relationship with China, or the technological cultural change towards migrants in the United States, and the starting out of a diaspora informational culture. Our analytical perspective in this book is basically empirical and systematic. We try to interpret the relationship between social structure and social actor, interests and conflicts through the historical background. We associate the idea of historical longue durée with turning points of Latin American experiment the last decades. today is related with the global and multidimensional crisis, however connected with other historical moments of political change, especially with the democratic transition, economic crisis in the 80s, the neoliberal moment principally in the 90s, and the crisis of neoliberal option associated with the starting out of the neo-developmentist orientation, especially in the first decade of the present century. Thus, the idea of historical continuity allows a better comprehension of the current change. So to emphasize, under this perspective, permit to us to better understanding the structural and political change we live on today. Our book, ¿Es sostenible la globalización en Latinoamérica? Globalization in Latin America is sustainable, was for us a point of reference. The definition of historical turning point was elaborated for another sociologist, Hispanic classic for the world, not only for Latin America, Don Jose Medina Echeverría. When he analyzed the transformation of oligarchy regimes to the state patrimonial corporative, he underlines, irremediably in the sight of all the traditional consistence, Latin America is now being lost. This raises two essential and unavoidable questions. First, what are the foundations of the new structure which is superseding the old, and what's contained within from the earliest stage of its decomposition? And second, where is the ultimate basis for the price of conscience that with the event of the new economy is disclosing the physiognomy of the immediate future? The principal change for us in a context of a global and regional crisis was to describe and analyze a new society. I mean, new technology of transformation, the starting out of the network society, the crisis of the patriarchal system, cultural mutation in religion, digital communication, and new social movement, of course, states and political system limits. Let me introduce some remarks or complete some remarks that Manuel told us. We analyze a new extractivist economy that we call the informational extractivist, a new economy that works in different ecological territories with new forms of production, commercialization, and financial activity based in information and communication networks. They are systems that operate at global level. The new organization form of the transnational enterprises in Latin America. We retake concrete examples in the case of lithium, oil and gas, soya, coffee, etc. As Manuel underlines, the case of the criminal economy is, and especially cocaine activity, is one of the most important global forms of the capital accumulation in Latin America. And in the world too. Only, for give an example, only at year around $500 billion are landed in Europe. Another key point that Manuel says was the structural transformation in the urbanization, a polycentric process of urbanization that connects human development, increase of levels in human development, with the idea that Manuel put in the book, the inhuman development. Everything is associated with a strong ecological impact and complex system of interaction between the informal sector and the informational economy. 80% now of the economy, or 80% of the population now in Latin America is urban. And the levels of social differentiation become each day more complex and unjust. Around 70% of the population have feeling of injustice towards social distribution and incomes, and in addition, the high levels of violence. Le mal-être is in the center of the cities every day in our continent. And perhaps what became a paradigmatic situation is that the principal economy activity is in the countryside, but people live now totally in the cities, in the big cities especially. On the other hand, We studied the network society, new forms of consumption, a generalization of a techno-sociability culture, principally between young people and migrants. The diaspora culture becomes some type of new informational way of reproduction at global scale. And for that is a key issue, the kind of work that I think you can do it, and you do it in your new center. The individualization of the consumption of a new media and the main vector of cultural construction. In the book, you can find several data about the active integration of Latin American societies in the informational communication system. And of course, the important social process of differentiation. In this context, family structure transformation is an important issue. Nuclear and extensive families are almost over on this, and this is very important fact. A new horizontal complex family starting out and followed by a hard crisis of the patriarchal system. The limits and the institutional crisis of the Catholic institution was another important change. Manuel and myself, we discussed very much this point and the role who plays the charismatic leader of the Pope. At the center of these transformations, new cultural and social movements emerged: indigenous, Afro-descendants, young Protestants with ethical demands, ecological mobilization, and gender reivindications. But at the same time, and that is very important say, the same time, new conservative mobilization became another important fact that changed political spheres in Latin America. All this change is expressed in a new public space of communication that we call digital politics, of course inspired in the book of Manuel. Media politics and social networks build the space of a new political power now in Latin America. Let me finish with some consideration treating cultural and social movements as the new possible ways of political and cultural alternatives. In general, conflicts and protests in Latin America have similar features: exclusion, platform, and chronic inequalities, a combination of social process manifested at national and international level. Practical rationalities are coming from tension that arise from social reproduction coexist with demands of for greater institutional efficiency and effectiveness and systematic cultural conflicts. In this arena, the states are omnipresent in all conflict spheres. However, each day comes with less possibility of dealing the subject. Cultural movements are demanding for ancestral identities recognition. The mobilization of different pueblos originarios and Africa descended, reborn, particularly from the democracy reinstallations. Today, the denial culture toward others and the colonial social stratification are questioned by these identities movements. The project of the Estado Plurinacional de Bolivia is an important institutional reference at global level. In a similar way, the environmental protest through the region is generally associated with indigenous people. These movements fight against pollution and extractivist economy, from the Sioux of Mayas in the north and Central America to Andinos and Mapuches in the south of the continent. For example, the important protests from Chiquitanos and Tivnis against the destruction of the Amazonian territories. Many of them began to be communicated in networks and plan actions together. For example, Mapuches and Sioux struggling against the impact of the tracking system in their territories. In addition, another important point of global reference is the indigenous cosmovision about the relation with nature. Everybody is part of the Pachamama system. The different mobilization and the new organization from the Afro-descendants in Brazil for human rights are really remarkable. We have a chapter about that. Three important waves, for other side, of social movements are connected in the last 30 years. The movement searching again for the settlement of democracies in the 80s. The reivindication for a new way of life and human rights was very important. This happened from the miners to the young rock and roll or salsa movements. A second wave was against the already marked social consequences of neoliberal movements. And a third wave consists in the young movement who demand ethics in politics, trust, and the new citizenship. How are we underlying in this book? These movements are crucial for their ability to drive their information codes and move from into the modern world, demanding a better education and the incorporation of science and technology in development. Finally, an ethic capable of governing politics and development. We study particularly the case of student mobilization in Chile, Brazil, and Mexico. These movements are now everywhere with a chain of social explosion demanding dignity and trust to the politician and the states. From Santiago Plaza Dignity to the strong actions in Lima, Bogotá, El Alto, with a high level of Aymara women participation, to Guatemala and even Honduras. Last but not least, the women movements are strategic for the new possible cultural change. These mobilizations generally connect with the other and principally in the middle of the patriarchal system of power, demanding a brutal change of the cultural relationship that organize societies, the everyday life in our continent. The new informational capacity of action and innovation of this movement is crucial in the middle of the culture of violence and negation of the human rights autonomy. One example, the Human Development Report for Mercosur about youth, inclusion and innovation shows a better capacity of agency in all the social status and in the different age in the Mercosur, a better capacity of action to transform targets in realities. Women can articulate better demand of recognition, participation, and integration that demand. So the change of cultural power at the end of the patriarchal system is one of the principal challenges for the Latin American societies. That is for us the question for the future in terms of development and in terms of democracy. Finito.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Manuel, for this fascinating presentation and full of interesting ideas. We've got numerous questions that I'll try to relate to you. You probably can read them in the chat. We have first question from my colleague, Carol Wise from USC. And she asks about Chile's pension system and the privatization of the pension system and the demands for change and what's the right path forward. And I think I may add to that it's so interesting in the book that you make, you analyze quite in depth social movements led by youth. But the reality of the region is that the region is aging very rapidly, and we're probably past the demographic dividend. So I think Carlos is a great question about the pension system in the midst of the current economic crisis and how states are going to be able to address this crisis.
Perfect answer. You want us to comment? Because you gave the perfect answer, but if we have to work a little bit more to earn about our breakfast, Fernando, you know better about Chile, although I have been there literally in the demonstrations.
So no, thank you. It's okay. The only thing that I must tell you is that one of Manuel write a book. He write a book about this, and we together write an article about this. So I can put some points. For me, this is one of the most important problems of the crisis of the Chilean way of development, neoliberal way of development. the way of reproduction of this concentral power. Remember, the process of privatization is concentrated in the economical elites in Chile. So the level of accumulation, the importance of the interest is a key issue for the Chile model, the neoliberal of development. And the principal demand, not only of young people, around, if I remember well, 90% of the population want change this system of pension. And this system of pension is a key issue in all the chains of the model of reproduction.
Exactly.
The problem in Chile, I don't know what you think, Manuel, about that. They are a good discussion, a good critical discussion about the Chilean model, but I don't see alternative to the model. They are not a discussion of a new model of development in Chile.
Good cooking is slow cooking. You see, it's no one expected the explosion of last October in Chile. And everybody thought that was finished as soon as they promised a new constitution and they did a number of reforms and they went back into the streets. And the pressure is not going to diminish until there is a true reform of the welfare state system. So I think Hernan very much pointed out a critical thing in Chile, although young people are those who march, who confront the police, etc., as always in the world. I mean, this is what happened. Yeah. Some people die for the entire revolution, but the critical thing is the overall the welfare state model, meaning the absence of any welfare state, the idea that the market can handle everything. And this is particularly critical for the large part of the population that reaches old age under the new pension system and simply are going to be miserable, as if they were in a Latino neighborhood in New York.
We have another question, Fernando Manuel, from Aguinaldo Melo, about the rise of the right-wing parties in Latin America and its relation to the military governments of the last 5 or more decades. I know you answered that. I mean, I know you addressed that in your book, but I also wonder, you wrote the book probably a few years ago or months ago, at least, and there's been new developments, new elections in some countries. So I wonder if you can address that question, but also if any of the recent events have a change, or how do you see the new elections of the past months?
Elections where?
Of the elections of the past months. I'm thinking Bolivia, I'm thinking municipal elections in Brazil. So, yeah.
Thank you. Well, Bolivia, if I say anything about Bolivia, Fernando kills me because he organized the whole revolt. So, Fernando, confess.
Oh, it isn't true. But anyway, it to the contrary. I am the analyst and he is the actor in Bolivia. But anyway, I can make some analysis. Of course, in Latin America, we live a moment, a curious moment, because new starting things like, say, Medina Echeverria are sleeping and now are awakened. One political actor who awake in Latin America is the military. We have the military presence again, directly or indirectly, in the conflict in Latin America, in the political and social conflicts in Latin America, with different ways. For example, in the case of Uruguay, a military was play an important role for the victory of the right. For example, in the case of Brazil, is totally connected the army with a president from the army, who comes from democracy system. He comes from the crisis democratic system. Other important situation is the case of Chile. The policy go to the streets repel to young movements. And the level of legitimacy of the policy now in Chile and all the political system, but particularly the policy, is so down. And in the case of Bolivia, was the same thing in some ways, because the army participated directly and indirectly in some kind of coup d'etat linked to the errors of the government. But the social mobilization, the fatal errors of the elites in power, the division of the different candidates, and the capacity of the social movements, particularly in the Aymara sector, in La Paz, changed the situation. And by electoral way, we have a fantastic victory of mass in the election. And all become, in some way or another, in a moment of relative normality. So in 4 or 5 things, different similar situation with different results. I don't know if you want to add something more.
Thank you. For obvious reasons, here in Southern California, we have a particular interest in Mexico. So my colleague Jerry is asking about your interpretation of the AMLO presidency in Mexico. It's about 2 years now. How is dealing with challenges of security and corruption, 2 issues that you just addressed that are very important in Mexico?
Thank you. López Obrador is at the same time a new hope for Mexico and a very complex leadership. We know that the Mexican state had been corrupted all the way up to the presidency. This is critical. We also know that the combination between the armed force, the narcos, and a significant part of the state, particularly at the local and state level, have completely rotten the Mexican state and the Mexican society, and hundreds of thousands of people killed, disappeared, etc. So we cannot simply evaluate AMLO as it's a good president, it's a bad president. For the moment, it's a president that has restored some level of legitimacy and some level of control from the state over the multiple mafias that have been governing Mexico for many years. So in that sense, that explains why he received an unqualified support by about 2/3 of the population, and why, in spite of some number of problems, he continues to have this support. Problems I see with AMLO, I must say that I have very good personal friends on the left-wing part of the AMLO administration, and I trust them, and I trust their instinct that they are not simply being manipulated. They are too smart for that. But I would add that there are a number of things. We know that AMLO himself, largely an evangelical of some kind, has relied on the support of some strange evangelical churches that I always think is a complicated matter. And also, from time to time, does surprising things. I think his policy on pandemics has been completely irresponsible for a number of months, and still has not put his policies in order. And this is a fundamental thing. It's not peripheral. And I must say that this is almost anecdotal, but maybe not so much, that his hesitation to accept Trump's victory, Biden's victory, and say that he also was stolen the elections like Trump, frankly, is surprising. I think that was I don't think it was any political calculation. That was a psychological reaction. Oh, you see, all the important presidents in the world, they lose elections because they are stolen. So I think ultimately he will have a good rapport with Biden, because it's in his interest, the interest of Mexico, and the interest of the United States.
And Manuel, that sends me into a question by Juan Ortiz Floyler, which is exactly about what can we expect from the Biden administration about Latin America. Well,
first, he starts from a very solid ground, worse that we were cannot be. So that's how sometimes the rate of economic growth is fantastic when you are minus 20. This is the same situation. But being more specific, first of all, I think we could expect, with care, but we could expect some level of reestablishment of a normal relationship with Cuba. Because after all, it was the Obama administration, and therefore the Obama-Biden administration that started that. And Trump has completely changed that, not only ideologically, but as a way of building a support base in Florida and in other places among exiled Cubans and Venezuelans. Well, now I think the Democrats have to understand that Florida, because of this particular Latino population, is not anymore a swing state. It's solidly Republican because exactly these Latin American policies. So let's say the cost of being more friendly toward different regimes, regardless of the ideological strong differences, this cost has diminished now for the Democrats because it's already to some extent amortized. Now, the other thing that I think is particularly important is that the presence of Trump in the White House encouraged directly or indirectly all kinds of subversive maneuvers in Latin America, from Venezuela, which of course has to go through a process of fair elections monitored by the international community, but certainly is not a matter of starting a civil war in Venezuela by invading Venezuela with multiple Bahías de Cochinos. And that, of course, was indirectly inspired or permitted or implicitly covered by the Trump administration. And the same thing in other cases. Bolsonaro just has a mantle of protection from Trump. And losing that, it's going to change many things in Brazil. The Bolivian military would not have launched a coup d'etat, not kind of a coup d'etat, but a coup d'etat, without the trust that if there were some problems, the American administration would not object or even would help if necessary. In other words, I think that the end of the Trump administration, although maybe it's the night of the walking dead that is waiting for us, will go well with the Camanchaca. But let's say that, yes, the 20th of January will have a Democrat and a Democratic president in the United States. And that, I think, is actually more significant than in a long time for Latin America. Not that it's going to be pro-left, pro-liberal, no, nothing like that. But it's going to be respectful of Latin American democracies. And that's already a lot.
Thank you.
Fernando, may I say something? Because I have a question, Manuel, about that. No. Of course, the situation now will be better than in the past with Trump. That is okay. But my question is, which will be the future in the short time? we come back to the classical kind of relationship between Latin America and United States? I hope no, because the situation is totally changed. No, so the problem is like, how deal a new process of connection in terms of global politics. For example, vis-a-vis China. China became the most important economy for South America.
Correct.
How you deal that? The drug situation, as you say, is another situation. And the most important that you put it is the idea of the situation of migrants. You cannot understand more Latin America if you understand what happened in the Latin United States. But you cannot understand the Latin United States, the says that you tell us, if you don't understand what happened in Latin America. No?
This last point is very important. That's why we have this center on Latino and Latin American studies, which is really very, very significant in many ways, and this is one of them. But look, the problem is, as you said, well, South America, not Mexico, and not even Central America, is now the main economic connection on the global level is China. Even Brazil, Bolsonaro, Brazil, where they have started to use the Chinese vaccine. That's quite interesting. But that could be read in two different ways. On the one hand, South America does not need anymore a connection to the United States, so it's relatively indifferent. On the other hand, my assumption is that the Biden administration is still going to be very tough on China policy in the world, because it has become a competitor that they were not expecting, and this is, Republicans of course are much hockey in that sense, but this is also the Democratic administration. China is looked upon extraordinary suspicion, and therefore I think the Biden administration is going to try to counter in South America Chinese influence. However, the issue would be, is that through traditional diplomatic means, or could be a good policy of becoming important in investing and helping development in South America to remove the excessive dependency on China, which is exactly what the China did 15 years ago, moving into Latin America with the idea, hey, you don't have to be just under the economic domination of the United States. So situation is going to move clearly in that sense, but let's not expect that it's going to be a completely new relationship in terms of the working the interest of Latin American development. It really depends, and this is still uncertain. But the China factor more complicates than helps in this particular case.
We have I think it was a really interesting question from Martin Pacman about political polarization, something that we talk a lot in the elections here in the US, but you can observe in Latin America as well. And interestingly, I would say, because in Latin America, we traditionally don't have a two-party system as we have in the US, and yet you see the same level of polarization. So I wonder if you can talk about the question of polarization in Latin America, and maybe more for you, Manuel, because I know you've examined this in the context of social media and communication technologies, and how that factors in this high levels of polarization that are observed in the region.
Well, I answer on polarization, and Fernando, you have worked so much on the social media, you could say something about that. There is a dramatic polarization in Latin America. In some cases, and this is not party polarization, this is social polarization, ethnic polarization, and particularly take Brazil. Brazil, the polarization that led to the dismissal, actually that was a kind of a coup rather than a coup. And that was supported by a large part of the population, as was shown later on in the elections, that Bolsonaro won clearly and overwhelmingly. And that came from the polarization. They were not oligarchs, those who voted for Bolsonaro. This kind of right-wing populism is rising all over the world, and Bolsonaro took advantage of that. And that part of the polarization with what I would call different segments of the population, particularly between the marginal groups and the poor, the really poor, and then the poor that are not connected to the institutions, and the poor that have been helped by the Brazilian government. So there is polarization in Brazil. There is tremendous polarization in Chile. There has been polarization in Argentina that continues now, but the new regime is smoothing out issues. And in Bolivia has been gigantic polarization that even now could have regional serious consequences, because Santa Cruz always tries to go away and become a Brazilian state as soon as they can. And even if in the past the revolutionary peasants and miners stopped them from doing so, well, but now even that Camacho, the leader in Santa Cruz, is clearly extremely antagonistic and almost always asking for a coup in Bolivia. That is also increasing polarization. And let's say Colombia, and let's say Venezuela. So we really have a major problem that goes together: extreme social and ideological polarization and institutional crisis almost everywhere. And in that sense, what we have been trying to show, which were the social and economic roots of this polarization that leads also to institutional crisis of a new type. Democracy in Latin America is not stabilized, because we were so unlucky that when we finally reached democracy, the wave of all other factors destabilizing democracy came in. So the traditional forms of democratic incorporation of different segments of society into the political system has failed. And that's why we still have hope that from the social movements up and through the reconstruction of some new forms of political parties, that things could change. But for the moment, we are in the process of decomposition and deinstitutionalization. Fernando?
No,
the role of social networks?
I think we can discuss, we discuss this kind of things so much, but for me, we have a wave at global level of polarization. Europe is totally polarized, no?
Absolutely.
No? The United States is totally polarized, no? And Latin America too is a global phenomenon. It's connected with the crisis of the liberal model of development, who was important everywhere, and they are not social response to this crisis. The only social response of this crisis became from a conservative, or comillas, populist, national, conservative regime, as you write several times. And things similar are in Latin America. Of course, Santa Cruz has a personal, the elites of Santa Cruz were connected with the government of Evo Morales. They participate in the economical model, but not the middle class of the political society. The middle class in Latin America, or part of the middle class, even the new middle class, how we write in the book, even the new middle class are against neo-developmentist model and reformist program. So this model of authoritarian regimes is connected with this situation this conform or this situation, the mal-être in the middle class, product of the process of neo-developmental model, no? So that is the problem. The problem is how we can reconnect one society, one region with others, and which will be the capacity to rebuild new connection. At the moment, it's totally polarized in all these countries, no? And I don't know the solution, but the problem is like that.
Thank you, Fernando. We've run past what we hope or what we expected to be a 1-hour conversation. I wonder if you can answer one more question. We have a number of questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to all of them. But I think I have a really interesting question from my colleague Peter Mongi that asks about whether any of you, for example, you've been writing about Latin America for many years, and is there anything that's just happened recently that would make you rethink or think, well, maybe I would have written something different if I knew what was happening in 2020? For example, Manuel, your Network Society trilogy in the 90s, and now, of course, you've lived through until 2020, and there's so much that's happened. So, but for both of you, I think it's an interesting question about whether any of your previous analysis, you would have thought something different now that you've know what's happened here in the present in 2020.
Well, in terms of the network society, on the contrary, what I have seen is an expansion and an interstitial diffusion of networks everywhere, in every dimension, both globally, locally, politically, economically, and social networks have become the critical space of communication, and therefore they are concentrated polarization, they're concentrating social and political mobilization. I would say, on the contrary, that not on the contrary, because it's an open question, the model of analysis of the network society, to which I'm not personally attached, except that if I see it useful, I continue. If it is not useful, I discard it, as I did always with all kinds of social theories. So I think, on the contrary, that is being extremely useful to understand the reconfiguration of network, global and locally, and the reconfiguration of politics and society and social movement and all these indigenous movements that Fernando talks about. It's a critical question now, the reconstruction of, I wouldn't say political left, I would say institutional alternatives expressing the demands of the society as emerging from both rebellions and social movement. How this energy of the society that Fernando has studied in social, how all this is going to be both channeled into the institutional system and reforming the institutional system and the policies of the institutional system. And therefore, the networking between culture, values, social movement, institutions, and the global economy and the alternative becomes, methodologically speaking, absolutely critical. Fernando?
Yeah, thank you. No, I totally agree with you. Perhaps the only thing that I want to emphasize is that we finish our book and our discussion, not only in Latin America, no, with other countries too. For example, you in China, I stay in India with my friend Sanali. We discussed the situation of Camanchaca in India and you in China. And we speak about from the Latin American
perspective. No Camanchaca in China. There's no Camanchaca. In all this polarization and problems, there's one quiet, efficient society that even tamed the pandemics and is growing at 3%.
Yes, but not all the time. I say that Camanchaca continue at global level like a serendipity moment. Anybody knows what happened. Even the Chinese don't understand the reality, don't control immediately the reality, even with an authoritarian state. For us, was more complicated because we live at that moment a crisis, United States too. But the thing is, anybody understands really well the Camanchaca impact, the pandemic crisis, and the answer to this Camanchaca serendipity situation and health situation. This is a global phenomenon. The question for me, perhaps without China, we must discuss these things, you know better than me. The question is that politics and institutional systems have or not have capacity to deal today with this Camanchaca serendipity phenomena. The politics, yes, he say they think they can do it, but really I'm not sure.
But Confucianism helps. Here is where culture is something there. I think the attempt to bring a pattern of extremely individualistic Occidental Western culture on Latin America, where many cultures are much more communitarian and much more ready to cooperate rather than to compete. This dichotomy between the overimposed dominant culture and the traditional culture that could evolve and could have evolved and they still even persist at this moment, what is the critical point? I'm sorry about that because I'm in the middle of these trenches. What is the critical factor to control pandemics? To convince everybody, you can say even authoritarian terms, but there is no authority that can stop people, they don't work. To convince everybody that we all have to be responsible for each other. And this is what's happening in many societies. People, we the people are not responsible. And in that sense, I think the culture of cooperation, the culture of harmony, if we can use this deep philosophical word, shows that is a key element to survive as humans and as humans in a planet that we are destroying.
Thank you. Thank you, Manuel, for this very stimulating conversation. I will turn over to my colleague Juan to wrap the event for us.
Thank you, Hernan. Manuel, Fernando, muchísimas gracias. And I am thrilled to have this as one of the first events of the center. And I think the points that you raised about we're in the process of constructing a new citizenship, and the way that you have centered Afro-Latinos, indigenous people, women, and social movements at the center of really rebuilding what it means to talk about citizenship and the future of Latin America. I think we're having a lot of similar conversations, and we see in the United States, and we see similar patterns, right? The response by the right and the conservative, entrenched conservative movements, trying to also get some of that space and to be involved in that conversation. But I think we are going to continue as a center to facilitate these kinds of conversations. And as I said at the beginning, we do take a hemispheric approach to this. We think that it's important to understand both what is happening in Latin America and with the Latino population in the United States, and more importantly, how those two things intersect with one another. And so thank you very much for a really great conversation. Felicidades with your libro, and Hernan, especially to Hernan, who really took the initiative and organized this event today. Thank you all for joining us. I ask that you all check into our website, register for our newsletter. We will continue to have these kinds of events and publicize them. And thank you very much for joining us today. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Juan and Hernan. Happy to be with you sometime.
Okay.